The cold, wet embrace of the Redwood Coast fog was less a weather condition and more a complete state of being in Humboldt County, Northern California. It clung to the twisting lanes of Highway 101, a thick, silver-gray curtain that swallowed headlights and muffled the world into an uneasy silence. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a scent usually comforting but tonight felt oppressive, pushing down on the scattered thoughts of Artie Jensen. Artie was driving his aging, heavily modified Jeep Wrangler, a vehicle that looked as if it had survived the last 2 decades through sheer stubbornness, much like its owner. The Jeep's single good headlight beam was fighting a losing battle, cutting only a short, blurred tunnel through the dense vapor ahead. Artie was 53, though his lined face and the deep-set exhaustion in his blue eyes suggested a man who had lived through 70 hard years. His thick, slightly graying beard was neatly trimmed, a small nod to civility he maintained despite his self-imposed isolation. Tonight he was wearing his Corps uniform, a heavy forest green flannel shirt, layered over a warm thermal undershirt. Practical and unremarkable, perfectly suited for blending into the rugged landscape he called home. His hands, large and calloused from years spent rappelling from helicopters and wielding fire tools, gripped the steering wheel just firmly enough. He was heading back to his remote cabin after a necessary, and therefore resented, trip into the small town of Arcata for supplies. The silence of the deep woods was his usual preference, a sanctuary from the relentless internal noise, the screaming whispers, as he privately called the memories of his life as a smokejumper. But tonight, the fog seemed to concentrate those whispers, turning the quiet road into a loud, suffocating box. He thought of his late wife, Clara, and the cabin that had become both his refuge and his prison since she passed 5 years ago. He was pushing the speed limit, anxious to be behind his own heavy door, away from the world and its unpredictable demands. He hadn't seen another pair of headlights for nearly an hour, and the isolation was beginning to feel less like peace and more like a premonition. Then the tunnel of light ahead was suddenly, brutally interrupted. Artie's foot slammed onto the brake pedal with the instantaneous reflex that had kept him alive through 20 seasons of fighting the fiercest wildfires the West Coast could throw at him. The Jeep shuddered violently, its aggressive off-road tires fighting for purchase on the damp asphalt slicked with condensation and pine needles. The heavy vehicle slid, the back end fishtailing toward the deep, shadowed ditch where the ancient redwood forest began its silent watch. Artie fought the wheel, pumping the brakes with expert control, the movement as natural to him as breathing, his heart immediately shifting from its slow, desolate rhythm into the frantic, purposeful beat of a man in an emergency. The Jeep finally ground to a bone-jarring halt, angled awkwardly across the single lane of the highway. Artie let out a ragged breath, the sound swallowed immediately by the thick air, and then stared into the spot where the ghost in his headlights had appeared. It was not a deer, nor a coyote, nor any other animal seeking refuge from the cold dampness. It was a dog. It was a Labrador retriever, a magnificent creature, large and muscular, its coat a stunning, almost silvery pale yellow, now matted with dampness and fog. The dog stood perfectly still, directly in the center of the weak headlight beams. Artie immediately recognized the signs of a trained animal. It was not cowering or running. Its posture was rigid, rooted to the spot, a living blockade. He could tell by the dense, powerful chest and the slight stiffness in its stance that this was a dog with a job, a purpose that superseded fear. It was a K9, he thought instantly, or something close to it, perhaps retired military or police. Artie reached a hand out to the worn, leather-bound flashlight on the passenger seat, but held back, sensing that a sudden movement might spook the animal into darting under his wheels. "Hey, buddy," Artie muttered into the cold cab, his voice rough and low, the tone he used to calm a frightened deer. "You're supposed to stay on the porch. Move along now." He tapped the horn once, a short, sharp burst that was instantly swallowed by the fog-dampened air. The dog didn't flinch. It simply stared. The dog's eyes, a brilliant amber color, were fixed on Artie through the windshield. There was no aggression in the stare, no territorial challenge. Instead, Artie saw a terrifying, profound intelligence, coupled with a palpable, almost human level of desperation. It was a calculated, deliberate gaze, one that seemed to assess and plead at the same time. The Labrador's muzzle, flecked with white condensation, was pointed straight at him, its ears slightly flattened but constantly swiveling. This was a message, not an accident. Why would a trained dog risk a collision with a 2-ton vehicle in the middle of a deserted highway? What could compel an animal with such discipline to break protocol and stop a stranger? The questions hammered at the mental walls Artie had spent years building around himself. Then, from the impenetrable darkness of the towering redwood forest flanking the road, the silence was violently fractured. It began as a faint sound carried on the damp air, a quick, muffled series of pops, too sharp and rhythmic to be fireworks or backfire. Gunshots. They were immediately followed by a short, guttural scream of human pain or terror, quickly cut off. The sounds were distant, perhaps a quarter-mile into the woods, but unmistakable to a man who had spent his adult life in remote, dangerous places. The sudden violence of the noise was a visceral blow to Artie. His entire focus snapped from the dog to the woods. In that split second, the Labrador, whose name Artie didn't know yet, but whose presence already felt monumentally important, made its move. The dog, whom Artie would later come to know as Max, jerked its head toward the sound of the gunfire, then looked back at Artie with a renewed, frantic intensity. It was an unmistakable, crystal-clear direction. "The danger is not here. It is there. Follow me." The dog wheeled instantly and bolted off the asphalt, its powerful legs churning as it plunged into the dense fog and undergrowth toward the source of the terrible sound. The large Labrador retriever, a creature built for tireless retrieval and loyal companionship, now moved with the streamlined, relentless speed of a wolf on the hunt. Artie didn't hesitate. The image of the dog's amber eyes was burned into his memory, and in that fleeting moment, they ceased to be the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of Sergeant Jack Rourke, his best friend and Smokejumper spotter, 32 years old, lying mangled and bleeding in the smoking remains of a failed wildfire containment line outside of Redding. "Don't leave me, Artie, please, you gotta fix this," Jack had pleaded, his tough guy bravado dissolved into pure, raw terror in those final moments, his eyes fixed on Artie with a dependence that had crushed Artie's soul. Artie hadn't been able to fix it. He had left him. That failure, that look had been the constant cold passenger in Artie's Jeep for years. Now that same look of soul-crushing dependence was transposed onto the face of the yellow Labrador. Artie's pragmatic mind, the part that dealt with logistics, risk assessment, and survival, screamed a dozen warnings. Stay in the vehicle. Call the authorities. You heard gunfire. This is an ambush. This is not your fight. He was 60, not 25. He was dressed in flannel, not a fire suit. He was alone, isolated, and walking toward the sound of a gun. But the soldier's instinct, the oath that had been sworn not to country or uniform, but to the man beside him, overwhelmed the hermit's caution. He couldn't leave Jack again. He wouldn't. Artie turned the key, stalling the Jeep's engine, letting the sudden silence fall like a shroud. He reached across the passenger seat, his fingers closing around the cold, heavy barrel of the military-grade flashlight he always kept close. He pulled the woolen hat tighter onto his head. He was moving before his conscious thought could register the decision. He pushed open the heavy Jeep door, the cold, wet air slamming into his face. He stepped out onto the slick asphalt, the sound of the door closing with a heavy thud, sealing his commitment. He took one last look toward the distant road, knowing that if he turned back now, he would carry the weight of this animal's plea and Jack's eyes forever. He lifted the flashlight, its powerful beam cutting a thick yellow cone through the suffocating gray. He had to follow the dog. He had to go into the abyss. The immense, silent cathedral of the Redwood National Park was a world apart from the highway Artie Jensen had just abandoned. The colossal trunks of the ancient trees, thicker than most houses, rose like dark, fluted columns, their tops lost entirely in the perpetual, heavy coastal fog that hung 50 feet above the forest floor. Down here, the air was intensely cold, still and sodden, clinging to the moss and the damp, rich earth. The only sound was the muffled rush of the wind high in the unseen canopy, a deep, hollow roar that amplified the silence below. Artie pushed forward, the beam of his heavy flashlight a frantic yellow sword cutting through the gloom. His breath plumed out in ragged white clouds, instantly dissolving back into the fog. He was moving fast, utilizing the long, ground-covering stride of a veteran woodsman, but he couldn't see the dog, Max. Yet he knew exactly where to go. Max wasn't a shadow, he was a silent guide, leaving barely perceptible breaks in the undergrowth or fleeting impressions in the damp soil that Artie's trained eye caught instantly. Artie was aware of the absurdity of his situation. An old man chasing after a strange dog into the darkness toward the sound of gunfire, but the adrenaline had purged the internal screaming whispers, replacing them with a singular, sharp focus. He was operational. He was on a mission. This simple, clear-cut duty felt like a painful relief. Artie's aging knees protested with every high step required to clear the fallen ferns and thick tangles of rhododendron, the pain a dull, grounding counterpoint to the rush of blood in his ears. He forced himself to ignore it, navigating by instinct and the animal's purposeful tracks. He realized Max was not just moving, he was leading. This wasn't the erratic flight of a frightened animal. Max's path was disciplined and direct, bypassing obstacles with an efficiency that screamed military or police training. The dog was moving with a veteran's awareness of terrain, utilizing low ground and shadow cover, constantly checking his six. He's clearing the perimeter, Artie thought, a flicker of respect cutting through his tension. Artie followed for perhaps 5 minutes, covering ground that felt far shorter than the sheer exertion suggested when the ground beneath his worn boots abruptly ceased to be flat. Max had slowed his pace and stopped dead near the edge of a sheer drop-off. The yellow Labrador was a pale, wet silhouette, positioned rigidly at the lip of what Artie quickly illuminated to be a steep, jagged slope, not a vast canyon but a dangerous, sudden break in the forest floor, likely carved out by ancient erosion and heavy winter rains. The drop was approximately 50 feet. Max, looking back to ensure Artie was there, let out a soft, low, keening sound, a plea rather than a bark, then instantly turned his amber gaze downward. Artie approached cautiously, playing his flashlight beam over the precipice. The slope was covered in loose soil, torn brush, and slick, exposed roots, all partially concealed by the dense moisture. At the bottom, wedged violently between the enormous exposed root system of a downed redwood and a cluster of young spruces, lay a dark blue Subaru Outback. It was overturned, resting awkwardly on its roof. The metal was horribly crumpled and distorted, looking like a crushed toy left discarded in the dark. The sight of the wreckage sent a heavy, cold dread straight into Artie's gut. The dog didn't wait for Artie's reaction. With a final, urgent glance at the man, Max plunged over the edge. It wasn't a careful descent. The dog half slid, half scrambled down the treacherous incline, navigating the loose earth and slick debris with desperate haste. Artie knew he had to follow. He had no choice. He braced himself, found a thick, stable route, and began his own descent, using his Smokejumper training to manage the drop. He moved slower than the dog, using his weight and friction, cursing quietly as his boots slid uncontrollably on the slick mud beneath the detritus. When he reached the bottom, the silence was intense, suffocating. There was no sound of a cooling engine, no smoke, just the heavy drip of condensation and the muffled sound of the dog's frantic movement near the wrecked car. Artie moved toward the vehicle, his heart hammering against his ribs, pushing down the memory of another wrecked machine years ago. The rear of the Subaru was destroyed, the roof crushed inward, and the rear window was blown out entirely. He swept the beam over the car, noting the severity of the impact. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly in the cold air. "Can anyone hear me?" No answer. He circled the car to the passenger side, which was now facing slightly upward. That was where he found Max. The yellow Labrador was pressed tight against the shattered remnants of the rear passenger window, his large, powerful body acting as a living windbreak, blocking the cold fog and sharp debris from blowing into the cabin. The dog was shivering violently, not just from the cold, but from exertion and a strained intensity. Artie noticed the disturbing sight instantly. The snow beneath Max's paws was stained with bright, fresh crimson. Shards of safety glass from the window frame had sliced into the dog's thick coat and legs. Yet Max refused to pull back. "Easy, boy," Artie murmured, the soldier's voice returning, low and steady. "I'm here to help." He reached out gently to touch Max's wet, icy fur. Max looked up, his ears flattened, a low, urgent rumble vibrating in his chest. It was not a threat to Artie, but a warning, an instruction to be careful and hurry. Max shifted his body slightly, allowing Artie to peer past him into the gloom of the overturned cabin. Inside, suspended upside down by her seatbelt, was a woman. Artie estimated her to be around 30 years old. This was Alara Vance. She was dressed in a sturdy but now torn tannish brown shell jacket and durable cargo pants, the kind of clothing worn by someone who works outdoors, a researcher or biologist perhaps. Her dark hair was matted and blood was slowly welling from a nasty gash on her forehead. Despite her position, her eyes were open wide with shock, staring blankly at the dark roof liner which had become her floor. Her breathing was shallow, but she was alive. Artie noticed her right hand was desperately gripping a small object resting on what was now the cabin floor, a small, intricately carved wooden box, clearly antique and valuable, protected by her last conscious effort. "Hi there," Artie said, keeping his voice steady and low. "My name is Artie. I'm going to get you out." He didn't wait for a response, moving his flashlight beam away from the woman's face to assess the structural damage. As he moved the light, Alara Vance's voice came out, thin and ragged, a whisper born of extreme duress. The brakes," she stammered, her voice catching on a sob that never fully formed. They cut them. They knew I was here. They followed me. You have to protect this." She pushed the small wooden box weakly toward the open window gap with her free hand. She was focused entirely on the object, not her own injury. "They cut the line. They're coming back for the box." Artie straightened up instantly, the words, "cut the line," freezing the cold dread in his stomach into a hard knot of resolve. He now had the full picture. This wasn't an accident, but an execution attempt, and he was standing in the middle of a crime scene. Max, sensing the change in the man, leaned his massive armored head against Artie's leg, a silent reassurance. "I know, ma'am," Artie said, his voice now flat and professional, the tone of a man taking command. "We'll get you in the box out. We need to go fast." He assessed the jammed door and twisted frame. He couldn't physically pull her out through the small rear window without potentially causing further injury, and the main doors were useless. Artie glanced back up the steep slope toward his jeep, 50 feet above. The solution was leverage. He needed his gear. "Stay right there, both of you," Artie ordered, giving Max a firm, reassuring pat on the head. He began the difficult climb back up the slick slope, his mission clear: retrieve the cable and winch system from the jeep to lift Alara Vance safely out of the wreckage. The cold, heavy fog of the Redwood coast was relentlessly persistent, a clammy accomplice to the violence that had just transpired. Artie Jensen, breathing hard from the difficult climb, was back on the highway shoulder where his Jeep Wrangler waited, a solid, familiar anchor in the swirling gray nothingness. The urgency was a cold knot in his chest, driving out all self-pity and past ghosts. He was in triage mode, the one state of mind where he truly excelled. He moved with a speed that defied his age, throwing open the Jeep's rear door and yanking out a compact but heavy-duty winch kit and a bag containing his personal cache of climbing ropes, carabiners, and webbing, tools he hadn't used for extraction in years, only for securing high-angle tree work. This was the gear of a Smokejumper, designed for rapid deployment and absolute reliability in hostile terrain. Artie selected a thick, high-strength rope and a series of specialized pulleys. His objective was clear: establish a 3-1 mechanical advantage system on the ledge above the wreck, allowing him to haul the weight of a person up 50 feet of slick mud. He didn't bother with the traditional emergency calls. The idea of using a regular cell phone to contact the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office felt intuitively wrong. The nature of the ambush, precise, immediate, and deep in the woods, suggested professional involvement. If they cut the brakes, they've bought the local wire, he thought. His distrust born of years spent operating outside official lines in emergency zones. He couldn't risk revealing the location and the fact that the victim, Alara Vance, was alive to someone who might be on the payroll of the timber smugglers. Artie secured the winch cable to the Jeep's front bumper, letting out enough line to reach the bottom of the ravine. He anchored the end of his climbing rope to a massive, stable redwood root near the edge of the drop-off and, using the rope as a lifeline, rappelled back down the terrifying slope. Max, the yellow Labrador, was exactly where Artie had left him, pressed against the wrecked Subaru's window, his amber eyes following every single move the man made, assessing the progress of the extraction. The dog didn't flinch as Artie knelt beside him. "Good boy, Max," Artie murmured, quickly threading the heavy rope under Alara Vance's arms and torso, creating an improvised harness that would distribute her weight. Alara, still lucid but slipping, watched him with wide, trusting eyes. Artie then moved to the car's undercarriage, deliberately checking the area near the front wheel. The flashlight beam settled on the braided black hydraulic hose, leading to the brake caliper. He reached out and wiped away the grit and moisture. The cut was surgical, perfectly perpendicular, no fraying, no jagged tear marks that impact or debris would leave. The realization hit him again with the cold certainty of a fatal diagnosis. This was a targeted execution. He was no longer a rescuer. He was now a soldier guarding a key asset. Artie wasted no time returning to the rear window. He fed the end of the rope up the slope, using the winch cable as a guide, and began the delicate process of setting the rigging. Max watched, his low, continuous rumble vibrating against the wreckage, a constant reminder of the danger. Artie finished assembling the pulley system on the ledge above, anchored tightly to the redwood root, his hands moving with the efficiency of a machinist. Now came the hardest part, the lift. Back down at the car, Artie gave Alara Vance a firm, encouraging nod. "It's going to be rough, ma'am, but hold tight. I've got the line." He then moved to the small wooden box Alara had been protecting. It was an exquisite piece of craftsmanship, dark wood with delicate brass inlays. He gently pried it from her numb fingers, securing it inside his own shirt pocket, close to his chest, making it his responsibility. He climbed halfway up the slope, away from the car but close enough to manage the operation. He attached the free end of the winch cable to the pulley system and began to work the winch. SX, the slow, mechanical grinding of the winch cable. Alara Vance's extraction began. The rope pulled taut, and she rose slowly, grinding agonizingly against the shattered window frame, twisting slightly in the air. As she ascended, Max did an extraordinary thing. He didn't follow the line of ascent. Instead, he held his position beside the wreckage until Alara Vance was a third of the way up the slope. Then Max, bleeding and shivering, carefully climbed out of the wreckage space. He moved directly to Artie's feet, positioning himself so that he was facing down the ravine, not up toward Alara. Max's amber eyes were fixed on the dark, thick woods below the crash site, the direction the assailants would likely use for their approach. The dog let out a low, almost inaudible growl, a continuous warning that was felt more than heard, communicating clearly, "I'm guarding the back door. Finish the mission." Max never took his eyes off the shadows below, his devotion absolute, his trust in Artie as the extractor complete. Artie looked down at the dog, a fresh wave of respect and connection washing over him. This dog was a professional, a true comrade. With a final, careful surge of power, Artie winched Alara Vance over the lip of the ravine and onto the stable ground of the highway shoulder. She was pale, unconscious from the pain and shock, but breathing. Artie rushed up, detached the winch, and carefully laid her on the softest bed of pine needles and moss he could find. Max followed Artie up to the road, but immediately positioned himself between the recovering woman and the tree line. Artie covered Alara with the sleeping bag he retrieved from the jeep. Now came the crucial secondary mission, the call. He bypassed the jeep's communication system entirely. Instead, he pulled a small, rugged satellite radio unit from his emergency kit, a piece of hardware independent of local grids. He switched it on. SFX, the distinct, sharp beeping of a satellite link establishing. Artie put on the headset, shielding the microphone from the ambient wind noise. He knew the frequency for the non-emergency dispatch network used by the Bureau of Land Management and CAL FIRE that covered the western states. Dialogue. Artie, calm, measured. CQ, this is Artie, calling Piper on CAL FIRE 1, over. He waited, the static hiss filling his ear. Moments later, a clear, sharp female voice cut through. Dialogue. Piper, professional, Oregon accent. Artie, Piper here, you're on the line, 5 by 5. What is it, you old goat? Over. This was Piper, his retired CAL FIRE colleague in Oregon, a woman who knew his habits and his codes. Artie didn't use real names, only codes. Dialogue. Artie focused, clipped. Piper, I have a major incident. Code. Wildfire, Humboldt sector. Confirmed ignition. We have 2 assets secured at the staging point. Key asset is the sample. Repeat. The sample has been found. Need a discreet relay to federal contacts now. Over. Dialogue. Piper, sharp, serious. Copy that, Artie. Wildfire in Humboldt. 2 assets secure. The sample recovered. I understand the criticality. I'll make the relay immediately and establish a protected line or extraction. Stand by. Out. The exchange was quick and professional. Artie took off the headset, a wave of cold relief washing over him. He had bypassed the local corruption and initiated the extraction through reliable channels. Artie gently lifted the unconscious Alara Vance and carried her to the passenger seat of the jeep, tucking her carefully inside and wrapping her in a thermal blanket. Max jumped into the back seat, placing himself protectively behind Alara. Artie checked the wooden box in his pocket. He then leaned in close to Alara, who stirred slightly. Dialogue. Artie low. They were after the box, Alara. What's in it? Alara Vance's eyes fluttered open, still shocked but focused. Dialogue. Alara whispered, weak. Seeds, old growth, redwood seeds. They're trying to steal the genetics. I found a way to stop them. The timber cartel. Vince. She drifted off, exhausted. Artie stared ahead into the fog. Timber smugglers. Illegal logging. That made sense. This wasn't about drugs or money laundering. This was about the powerful, dangerous greed for the last vestiges of the redwood giants. Artie started the jeep. He wasn't waiting for extraction here. He had to run to ground. He glanced back at Max, whose amber eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror. Dialogue. Artie, rough whisper. Time to move, partner. The endless, oppressive fog remained the primary character of the Humboldt County night, a silent, swirling cover that Artie Jensen used to his full advantage. The aging Jeep Wrangler despite its weary groans, clawed its way north along a forgotten, overgrown logging road. Its four-wheel drive engaged against the slick, muddy terrain. The journey to Artie's isolated cabin, a 20-minute white-knuckle drive from the highway, was a necessary retreat, a tactical maneuver to buy time and establish a fortified position. Artie knew the thick walls and remote location of his home were the only sanctuary they had against professional enemies who would soon realize their quarry had escaped. Inside the cabin, the heavy silence was a welcome relief from the wind and the fear. The cabin itself was a sturdy structure of weathered logs, built for endurance against the harshest Sierra and redwood winters, smelling faintly of wood smoke, old leather and pine, a smell Artie had long associated with solitude. He moved with quiet urgency, gently lifting the pale, unconscious Alara Vance from the passenger seat and carrying her into the main room, laying her on the leather sofa near the hearth. Max, the yellow Labrador, jumped down, limping slightly on his left front leg, which was stained with drying crimson from the glass shards. But the dog did not seek rest. He immediately positioned himself between the sofa and the front door, his amber eyes scanning the heavy log's walls, ears twitching, the perfect sentinel. Artie quickly built a fire in the old cast-iron stove, the flickering welcome warmth pushing back the cold and the heavy gloom. Artie's combat instincts took over, initiating triage. He retrieved his first aid kit, a military-grade trauma bag rather than a box of household bandages. He knelt beside Alara Vance, noting the gash on her forehead had stopped bleeding, likely due to shock and the cold. He cleaned and bandaged the wound with practiced care. As he worked, Alara stirred, her eyes fluttering open, now focusing on the rough-hewn log ceiling. Dialogue, Alara whispered, frantic. "No, no, they're here. The box." She scrambled backward on the sofa, clutching her hands to her chest, panic surging through her system. The realization that she was in a stranger's remote cabin, safe only minutes ago, returned with terrifying force. Artie stood back, keeping his hands visible and his voice low, steady, the tone of a man in control. Dialogue, Artie calm. "You're safe now, Alara. My name is Artie Jensen. I found you in the ravine. The box is safe, right here." He tapped the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, confirming the precious cargo was secure. But the panic was too strong. Alara Vance swung her legs over the sofa, attempting to stand, clearly intending to flee back into the darkness. She was terrified, believing Artie might be another threat or simply wanting to lure the danger away from him. Before Artie could physically restrain her, Max intervened. The dog, ignoring his own painful leg, stood up and limped over to the sofa. Max didn't bark or growl. He simply walked up to Alara Vance and gently placed his large head onto her trembling hand. His amber eyes looked up at her, not with command, but with a profound, unwavering look of trust and reassurance, communicating clearly, "I brought you here. I am here. You are safe." The simple, non-aggressive gesture broke through Alara's panic. Her frantic energy drained away. She collapsed back onto the cushions, tears finally spilling over, burying her face into Max's wet fur. Dialogue, Alara choked whisper, Okay, Max, thank you." Max had used loyalty, not force, to hold the line, a subtle but powerful confirmation of their unusual bond. Artie then turned his attention to Max, kneeling to examine the cuts on his leg. Dialogue, Artie murmuring, "You earned that one, partner." He cleaned the wounds carefully, applying antiseptic and wrapping the leg in a loose bandage, Max enduring the treatment with stoic, focused discipline. With the immediate triage complete, Artie returned to the corner of the room that housed his satellite radio unit. He needed to update his extraction contact Piper on their fortified location. Dialogue, Artie, low, clipped. Piper, Artie here, status update, assets secured in the Blackwood sector. Repeat, Blackwood. They are alive, but the threat is active. I'm fortifying. No direct contact with locals. Over. He intentionally used the word Blackwood as an internal code word for his cabin's location. He knew this message, though encrypted and relayed through Piper, was still a risk. The enemy was professional enough to be monitoring satellite bursts, looking for this very signal. Let them hear the ghost, Artie thought, knowing that by transmitting he was confirming they were still alive and initiating the hunt. But that was necessary to trigger the federal response. Meanwhile, 2 miles back, at the ravine crash site, the perpetual fog gave way to a chilling, stagnant darkness. Vince, the leader of the illegal timber operation, arrived with his crew. Vince was a man of cold, calculated intensity, about 40 years old, dressed in a charcoal gray soft-shell tactical jacket and dark pants, his face hard and devoid of emotion. He surveyed the wreckage with the grim efficiency of a man whose meticulous plan had failed. Dialogue, a Vince low, sharp. Empty, unacceptable, find the tracks. Vince quickly found the large, clear tracks of Artie's Jeep and the telltale imprint of a man's heavy boots. He moved to the spot where Artie had rigged his rope system. His eyes, sharp and predatory, scanned the disturbed earth. That's when he saw it. A small, rectangular object, half buried in the disturbed soil, near the route where Artie had anchored his main line. Vince knelt and picked it up. It was an old, tarnished bronze medallion. Vince wiped the mud off the surface with a gloved thumb. Engraved on the bronze was the stylized symbol of a smokejumper, a paratrooper dropping toward a forest canopy, and the distinct, unmistakable California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, CAL FIRE insignia. Vince's eyes narrowed instantly. Dialogue, Vince to his men, voice dangerous. A professional, a CAL FIRE veteran, a jumper. He knew the implication immediately. A simple local would call 911. A former smoke jumper, especially one living deep in the woods, would possess the specialized knowledge of terrain, high-angle rescue, and, critically, the distrust of local authority, a distrust that often extended to law enforcement, which was exactly where Vince had his contacts. Dialogue, Vince, voice rising, commanding. He knows the land, he knows the choke points, he won't wait for backup. Vince turned to his subordinate Logan, a young man dressed in a scruffy, ill-fitting camouflage jacket. Dialogue, Vince clipped. He's making a call. Find the signal signature. We move now. No waiting for the extraction team. If we wait, he fortifies. We eliminate the problem tonight. Find his hole. The discovery of the badge, Artie's calling card, had confirmed the hunter's identity and accelerated the timeline. Artie had traded a moment of necessary communication for a confirmation of the immediate, deadly pursuit. The Humboldt County fog, which had been Artie Jensen's tactical shield, was now turning against him, deepening into a chilling, impenetrable wall of white outside the cabin. The temperature was dropping fast, and the air inside the small log home was thick with the scent of pine smoke and metallic tension. Artie had moved into a state of cold, quiet focus, The years of fighting fires and responding to high-stakes emergencies snapping back into place. He knew the transmission he sent to Piper had served its purpose, alerting the feds, but it also served as a flare for the hunters. They were coming, and they would be here before the federal aid could arrive from hundreds of miles away. His log cabin, designed against nature's fury, now had to be hardened against human malice. Max, the 6-year-old yellow Labrador, was positioned near the fireplace, shivering slightly, not from cold, but from the coiled tension of his body. Artie had offered him a strip of venison jerky from his supply, but the dog merely glanced at it, then back at the door, refusing to eat. "He's on duty," Artie recognized instantly, a silent salute passing between man and dog. "He won't break the fast until the threat is gone." Artie moved to the center of the main room. He addressed the pale, bandaged Alara Vance, 30, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes from the sofa. Dialogue. Artie, firm, direct. "Alara, we're moving the command center. They're professionals. They won't use the front door." Artie pulled up the heavy woven rug near the kitchen, revealing a trapdoor set flush into the floorboards, the entrance to his root and firewood cellar. Dialogue. Artie, steady. "This is the keep. Stone and earth walls. Safest place we have." He helped the still weak Alara down the narrow wooden ladder, placing the small, intricate wooden box of precious seeds and the satellite radio unit safely in her care. Dialogue. Artie, low. "You lock this from the inside, and you don't open it for anyone but me. You hear shouting, you stay silent, you guard the sample." Alara Vance nodded, her terror superseded by the absolute simple trust she now placed in Artie and the yellow dog who had saved her. Artie lowered the trapdoor and kicked the heavy rug back into place, completely concealing the seam. Artie then began to fortify the cabin. He overturned the heavy oak dining table and shoved it against the front door, creating a secondary barricade. He moved to the small closet and retrieved his old hunting rifle, a lever-action .30-30, not military issue but reliable and powerful, checking the chamber and loading a fresh magazine. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man gearing up for a fight he hadn't sought. Then he turned to Max. Artie retrieved a piece of gear he hadn't touched since he left Cal Fire years ago. A thick, heavy leather working harness with wide, reinforced straps, designed for high-angle rescue dogs. Dialogue. Artie, murmuring, "Sorry, partner, this isn't perfect, but it'll have to do." Artie knelt, gently fitting the old leather harness over Max's powerful chest and back, securing the straps tightly. The material was thick and rigid, offering a modicum of protection against glancing blows. Max stood perfectly still, allowing the man to equip him, his posture stiffening further, recognizing the ritual of gearing up. Artie slapped the harness lightly when he was done. Dialogue. Artie, sharp, clear. "Max, guard," Artie commanded, pointing to the shadowed blind spot beside the barricaded front door. Max moved instantly, settling into a low crouch, his amber eyes fixed on the door, a low, continuous vibration of readiness running through his massive frame. He was no longer a dog. He was a silent, armed sentinel. The wait was the hardest part. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the heavy, rhythmic beat of Artie's own heart. Artie, wearing his forest green flannel shirt and his heavy coat, positioned himself at the side window, peering through a narrow slit in the heavy wooden shutters, the rifle resting across his knees. He didn't have night vision, but but he had something better. Max. The dog's ears twitched independently, scanning frequencies Artie's ears could no longer detect. Suddenly, the silence outside was violently shattered. SFX, the distant, strained choke of a generator dying. Vince's team had cut the power line to the propane generator. The small overhead light vanished instantly, plunging the cabin into absolute crushing darkness. SFX, immediate heavy silence. SFX, loud metallic voice. Vince amplified, distorted from the tree line. The attack had begun. Dialogue, Vince, cold, arrogant. Artie Jensen, we know you're in there, Smokejumper. We found your little bronze medal. Your wife isn't here to scream for you now. The voice was designed to goad, to shatter Artie's resolve by twisting his grief. Artie remained stone still, his jaw clenched, his hand resting lightly on Max's neck. He felt the low vibration in the dog's throat spike, a sharp warning rumble. Max was locked on. Artie didn't wait for a direct sound. He trusted the animal. SFX, a soft, almost inaudible scrape of climbing gear against the log wall near the kitchen. Max's head snapped sharply to the left, his body tensing into a rigid arc, pinpointing the approach vector. SFX, Artie pulling back the rifle hammer with a loud, mechanical clack. Artie swung the barrel to the left, aiming blindly into the darkness towards the kitchen wall. Dialogue, Artie shouted, warning, I see you, get back. He didn't fire. He waited. SFX. The scrape abruptly stops, followed by a frantic rush of receding footsteps. The warning shot was not needed. The message was clear. They knew he was aware and armed. The probe failed. But they changed tactics. SFX. The sudden, muffled crash of glass and splintering wood from the rear. A series of heavy, muffled impacts hit the back wall, near the kitchen, followed by the sickening sound of the rear window breaking. Immediately, a thick, grayish-white smoke began to billow into the room, stinging Artie's eyes and tearing at his throat. SFX, Artie's painful coughing, Max's violent sneezing, tear gas. Artie was momentarily blinded, struggling for breath. SFX, heavy boots thudding on the wood floor, rushing movement. Through his watering eyes, he saw two monstrous dark figures in gas masks burst through the rear window opening. One figure, the largest, was Logan, armed with a combat knife. Max launched himself through the thickening smoke. SFX, a low, savage, protective roar from Max, a sound of pure fury. Max didn't go for the large armored body. He went for the weapon arm of Logan. His powerful jaws clamped down onto Logan's forearm with crushing force. SFX, Logan's high-pitched scream of pain, the clatter of a knife falling. The dog, despite his pain and the gas, held fast. The second attacker, Vince, seeing Max disable his subordinate, rushed toward Artie, who was struggling against the smoke and the disorientation. Vince, 40, his face hidden behind a gas mask, was wearing his charcoal gray soft-shell tactical jacket. He lunged, a heavy boot slamming onto Artie's chest, pinning him against the floor. Dialogue, Vince, muffled, cold. It ends here, old man. Vince drew a second weapon, a small sidearm, and aimed it at Max. Dialogue, Artie, voice raw with fury. Max, down! Artie screamed, but Max was locked onto Logan's arm, protecting his handler's flank. Vince fired. SFX, deafening gunshot in the enclosed space. Max let out a sharp, wrenching yelp of pain. The impact of the bullet, though aimed at Max's side, was partially absorbed by the thick leather harness and his rib cage, knocking the powerful dog sideways. SFX, Max hitting the wall with a sickening thud, followed by a low, pained whine. Max collapsed, panting heavily, blood immediately staining the old leather of the harness. The sight of Max falling broke through Artie's final mental barrier. A volcanic, protective fury erupted. Artie roared, bucked his hips violently, throwing Vince off balance. Artie was on him before he could recover, grabbing the older man by the tactical vest straps and slamming him backward into the stone fireplace surround. SFX, a sickening loud crack of bone skull against stone. Vince's body went limp instantly. The other attacker, Logan, seeing his leader down, and Max beginning to struggle back to his feet despite the injury, scrambled backward through the broken window. The attack was over. The line held. The cold, oppressive darkness of the Humboldt County night began to surrender, not to the sun's warmth, but to the slow, steel-gray light of dawn filtering weakly through the retreating fog. The silence that followed the violence was shattered by a cacophony of sound that brought both chaos and salvation. Distant sirens, initially a faint whine, grew rapidly into the loud, immediate wail of emergency vehicles, accompanied by the heavy crunch of tires on the muddied logging road outside the cabin. Piper had delivered, relaying Artie's coded message, the wildfire alert, to the right federal contacts who, in turn, mobilized the local resources he trusted, Cal Fire personnel for support and Humboldt County Sheriff's deputies for the arrest. Inside the cabin, the scene was one of contained devastation. Furniture overturned, tear gas residue lingering, the faint, acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. Artie Jensen, 53, his flannel shirt torn at the shoulder, sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his hunting rifle resting safely beside him. His focus was entirely on Max, the 6-year-old yellow Labrador who was panting heavily, lying on his side. The thick leather working harness had saved the dog, absorbing the blunt force of the bullet, though Max was clearly winded and bruised. Artie stroked Max's head, the warmth of the dog a fragile comfort. The cabin door, already damaged by the assault, was thrown open, and a wave of blue and red strobes swept the interior. SFX, the loud, professional voice of a deputy commanding the scene. The room filled with the focused energy of law enforcement and medical teams. The deputies quickly secured the unconscious Vince, 40, his head bleeding from the impact with the stone fireplace surround, and the still moaning Logan. A deputy found the trapdoor. Dialogue, deputy firm. Ilara Vance, we're with the Sheriff's Department and Cal Fire. You're safe now. Ilara Vance, pale and exhausted but clutching the wooden box, emerged from the cellar. When she saw Artie and the injured Max, she rushed to the veteran, dropping to her knees. Dialogue, Ilara, raw whisper. You did it. You saved us, all of us. Artie awkwardly patted her back. The scene was quickly taken over by federal agents. Agent Miller, a tall woman in a sharp suit, briefly noted as the FBI contact, took command, her focus solely on Ilara Vance and the precious cargo. Dialogue, Agent Miller, clipped professional. Ms. Vance, the syndicate is scrambling. We're initiating immediate extraction. You are entering the Federal Witness Protection Program. New identities, zero contact. We have to move now. The emotional climax arrived by the helicopter landing zone set up in Artie's clearing, a muddy temporary patch 100 yards from the cabin. Ilara Vance was ready to board the awaiting U.S. Forest Service helicopter, which would take her to a secure facility. She clutched the wooden box. She turned to Max, who was sitting quietly, Beside Artie, his bandaged leg held carefully. Alara knelt and hugged the dog fiercely. Dialogue. Alara, soft, tearful. Go, Max, be a good boy. Go with me. Max began to walk toward Alara, taking 2 deliberate steps. Then the Labrador stopped. He turned away from the awaiting helicopter, the promise of security and the future. Max didn't look back at Alara Vance. Instead, he walked slowly, deliberately, straight back to Artie Jensen. Max walked to Artie's side, nudged his large head into Artie's hand, and then laid down at the veteran's feet, resting his chin on Artie's worn boot. Max's amber eyes looked up at the man, not with expectation, but with a settled finality. Alara Vance watched the exchange, a bittersweet understanding dawning on her face. She remembered Artie's devotion, his professionalism, and the silent, unspoken bond they had forged during the siege. Max had not merely protected her, he had chosen a new partner. Dialogue. Alara smiling through tears. He's retired, Artie, and he's chosen his retirement home. She walked over to Artie, unclipped the simple leash from Max's sturdy leather working harness, and placed the leash directly into Artie's large, rough hand. Dialogue. Alara, earnest whisper. He found the person he needed. You keep him. He needs a pack and a purpose. Thank you for finding my purpose again. She kissed Artie lightly on the cheek and walked toward the waiting helicopter, leaving the leash and Max behind. Artie, clutching the leash, felt the sudden immense weight lift from his soul. The long, desolate weight of failing Jack Rourke was finally gone. He had not failed this time. 6 months later, the harsh winter had finally broken, and the Humboldt County landscape was exploding with the vibrant, shocking green of early May. The air smelled intoxicatingly of pine, wet soil, and new life. Artie Jensen, looking noticeably lighter, with a confident spring in his step, was hiking a high, sun-dappled ridge. He was wearing a new, crisp khaki Cal Fire uniform shirt, a recent hire back into the state service. Artie had accepted an offer to join the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, Cal Fire, as a specialized resource consultant in the Humboldt area, using his deep terrain knowledge to protect the redwoods, the legacy Alara Vance had fought to save. Max, now fully recovered, trotted beside him. The dog was wearing only his worn leather harness, his coat shining like burnished silver in the sun. Max was no longer a K9 asset. He was Artie's certified emotional support animal, ESA, and more importantly, his partner. The low-grade tension that used to coil through Max's body was replaced by a rolling, purposeful gait, a mirror to Artie's own renewed health. They reached a secluded clearing dominated by a cluster of the largest redwoods, the very area Alara Vance had been researching. Max slowed, then sat down, waiting patiently. Artie knelt beside a massive, moss-covered trunk. Dialogue. Artie, soft, reflective. We did good, partner. This forest is safe. He placed his hand on Max's head, running his fingers through the thick, soft fur. Max leaned his entire weight against Artie's side, a gesture of absolute mutual belonging. Artie smiled, a genuine smile that reached his tired eyes. He had found his purpose again, not in running from the past, but in protecting the future. He had a job, a mission, and a family, a pack of one old man and one good dog. The redwood trees stood as silent witnesses to the sweetest surrender.